Holly and James had been in the house only 3 weeks when the first odd thing happened. They'd bought it cheap, a weathered colonial on the edge of town, the kind of place people drove past without noticing. It had sat empty for years, but they convinced themselves all it needed was love and repair. The first night, they drank wine on the bare floor and laughed about how much work it would take. By the 3rd week, the laughter had dried up. It started with the clock in the hallway, an old brass thing left behind by the previous owners. Every morning at 3:15, it chimed though its hands were frozen. James pulled the batteries, but the chime kept sounding. Holly shoved it in a box in the attic, but at 3:15, the muffled clang still echoed down the stairs. The lights began to flicker next, at first just in the kitchen, then in every room at once, always at night. They called an electrician, who found nothing wrong. "Wiring's fine," he said. "Old house quirks." But the flickering grew patterned, almost like Morse code. Bursts of light that seemed to form words neither of them wanted to decipher. One evening, while James showered upstairs, Holly stood in the living room unpacking books. She caught motion in the reflection of the darkened TV, a figure moving behind her, tall, stooped, its face blurred. She spun, heart racing, but the room was empty. That night she told James, and he nodded grimly. "I saw something too, in the bathroom mirror." Neither of them slept. The activity escalated. Doors opened on their own, slowly at first, then with violent force. The basement door was the worst. They'd agreed never to go down there after finding the steps broken and the air thick with mold. But every night, without fail, the door creaked open. James nailed it shut. In the morning, the nails lay bent on the floor, the door wide as if mocking him. Sleep became a battlefield. Holly woke often to whispers around the bed, voices just under hearing, moving from one side to the other. James swore he felt someone press against the mattress, weight dipping as though a body climbed in beside him. They began sleeping with lights on, but that only made the shadows deeper. By the 6th week, the house no longer felt like theirs. The smell of earth clung to every room, damp and metallic, though the windows stayed open. Footsteps paced overhead when they sat downstairs, and from the attic came a dragging sound, like furniture scraping through the space was empty. One night, Holly found the attic ladder lowered, though neither of them had touched it. A black smear ran down its steps, sticky to the touch. James insisted they leave. They packed boxes into the car, but when they tried to drive away, the engine wouldn't turn. The phones lost signal. Even the streets seemed to stretch endlessly, houses repeating like a looping film reel. Exhausted, they returned, too scared to admit the truth. They couldn't get out. The final night began with silence, a thick, oppressive hush that settled over every room. No footsteps, no whispers, no flicker of light. For the first time in weeks, the house was still. They dared to hope it was over. But at 3:15, the chime sounded again, louder than ever, rattling the windows. Holly clutched James's arm, eyes wide. The sound didn't stop after 12 strikes. It went on and on, filling the house until the walls seemed to vibrate. The basement door slammed open. Cold air poured out, carrying with it the reek of soil and rot. From below came a steady pounding, as though fists beat against the floor. James shouted, grabbing Holly's hand, pulling her toward the front door. But when he yanked it open, the porch was gone. Only blackness waited, endless and swallowing, stretching where the street should be. Behind them, footsteps climbed from the basement, slow, deliberate, each one shaking the floor. A shadow lengthened across the hall, tall and crooked. Holly screamed. James swung the flashlight, its beam catching the staircase. For a moment, they saw it, gaunt, faceless, its arms too long, its body made of shifting darkness. It raised one hand, and the lights throughout the house died. The last thing Holly remembered was the sound of the attic ladder snapping down, as if the house itself was opening its mouth. Weeks later, neighbors noticed the windows of the colonial stood dark. The moving truck never came, and no one saw Holly or James again. Inside, the house sat still, boxes half-packed, food rotting on the counters. The clock in the hall remained frozen, yet every night at 3:15 it chimed, rattling the walls. Sometimes, passers-by swore they saw figures moving behind the curtains, two shapes caught in endless circles through the rooms, never able to leave. Evan and Clara moved into the ranch-style house at the edge of the woods because it felt ordinary. After years in cramped apartments, they wanted something simple, quiet, and grounded. The price was suspiciously low, but the inspector had found nothing more than a leaky faucet and aging shingles. They signed the papers quickly, eager to begin. For the first few nights, it felt like a dream. Sunlight in the kitchen, a big yard for their dog, and a silence broken only by birds. But within a week, the house's stillness began to feel wrong. It started with the dog. A cheerful mutt who had never growled at anything, she began refusing to enter the hallway at night. She would sit at the threshold, ears flat, eyes locked on the darkened corridor, whining softly. Clara laughed it off, but when Evan tried to coax the dog with treats, the animal barked once, loud and sharp, then retreated to the porch and refused to come back in until morning. Then the photographs shifted. They had placed family pictures along the mantel, smiling faces, vacations, birthdays, but Clara noticed one frame turned slightly askew. She corrected it, only to find it tilted again the next morning. Over the next week, more frames changed. Some faced backward. One, a picture of Clara and her mother, had been removed entirely. The glass cracked, the photo folded and tucked beneath the couch cushions. The sounds began next. At first, faint scratching inside the walls, which they blamed on mice, but traps stayed empty, and the noise grew heavier, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging slowly along the wood. At night, the scratches gave way to thuds, soft and rhythmic, as though someone was knocking from inside the drywall. When Evan pressed his ear against the plaster, he swore he heard whispers on the other side. Sleep grew harder. Clara woke gasping one night, convinced someone was standing over her. She had felt the weight of eyes pressing down. Evan dismissed it as a nightmare until he, too, woke days later with the sense of breath against his ear, cold and sour. He turned, but no one was there. The dog had begun sleeping outside full time, scratching frantically at the door if forced indoors after dusk. One evening, Clara found a doorway drawn in charcoal on the living room wall. Rough lines, smeared by fingers, but unmistakable. Neither of them had made it. Evan scrubbed it clean, but the next morning it was back, drawn larger, darker, with faint marks suggesting hands reaching through. They painted over it, only to wake to the smell of burnt wood. When they looked, the doorway was back again, this time etched into the plaster, as though clawed from within. The activity escalated in waves. Lights flickered in patterns that felt too precise to be electrical faults. Cabinet doors banged open and shut when no wind stirred. At exactly 2:17 each night, the house shook with a dull tremor, rattling glasses and loosening nails. Evan began recording with his phone, but every file corrupted, leaving only static and a low groan that hurt to hear. They tried to leave once. Bags packed, dog in the car, they drove until the trees thinned and the road should have opened onto the highway. Instead, it bent back on itself, spitting them out in front of their own driveway. They tried again the next day with the GPS guiding them, but every turn folded back to the house, as though the streets had shifted while they weren't looking. The neighbors claimed they had never seen Evan or Clara leave at all. On the 12th night, Clara woke to the sound of footsteps pacing the hall. Heavy, deliberate, dragging slightly like someone limping. She shook Evan awake. They listened together as the steps stopped outside their door. The knob rattled. The door creaked open an inch before slamming shut with a force that cracked the frame. When Evan flung it open, the hall was empty, but the photographs along the wall had all been rearranged. Every smiling face was now blurred, warped, or turned away. Clara refused to sleep in the house again, spending hours on the porch wrapped in blankets. Evan grew pale and restless, muttering that the whispers in the walls had started saying his name. One night, Clara found him standing in front of the etched doorway, hand pressed against it, lips moving silently as though answering someone on the other side. She pulled him back, and his skin was cold as stone. The final night, they sat together in the living room, too afraid to close their eyes. At 2:17, the house shuddered harder than before. The etched doorway groaned, plaster crumbling as the lines widened into cracks. A stench of earth and decay poured through. Their dog howled from outside, claws scratching desperately at the door but refusing to enter. The cracks split open. From within, hands emerged, blackened, too thin, with nails like splinters. They clawed through, grasping for purchase. Evan shouted, grabbing Clara, pulling her toward the porch, but the air thickened, heavy as water. The living room bent inward, shadows twisting like a mouth opening wide. The lights blew out. Neighbors claimed they heard the crash that night, like a tree splitting in two. But when they looked, the house stood silent in the dark. Days passed with no sign of Evan or Clara. The dog was found at the edge of the woods, shaking, fur-matted, refusing to approach the house. Inside, dishes still sat on the counter, clothes folded neatly in drawers, but every photo frame was empty. The living room wall was bare, save for the etched doorway, now deeper than before. Fresh handprints smeared the plaster, pressed outward, waiting for someone else to come close. Mara and David bought the bungalow because it felt safe. One floor, wide windows, sunlight pouring into every room. It was the opposite of the creaking Victorian they'd rented for years. They wanted something modest, something warm to raise their daughter in. The first weeks felt almost charmed. Friends admired the bright kitchen, the yard bloomed with wildflowers, and the house seemed to exhale welcome. But little by little, the brightness dimmed. It began with the baby monitor. Their daughter was only 6 months old, and Mara liked to keep the receiver close. One night, as she folded laundry, she heard a lullaby drifting through the speaker. Not the soft babbling of her child, but a low humming tune, unfamiliar and unsettling. She rushed into the nursery, finding her daughter asleep, alone. The humming stopped the moment she entered. David insisted it was interference, another monitor in a neighbor's home, but Mara couldn't shake the way the melody clung to her ears. Soon, the house made its own music. At first, faint piano notes echoing through the hall after midnight. Then entire chords played wrong, sour and jagged. They had no piano. David searched every room, attic to basement, but found nothing. When he returned, the sound swelled louder, as if mocking his effort. Objects began to shift. Mara set her keys on the counter, only to find them balanced precariously on the crib rail. A framed photo of her parents turned itself face down on the mantel each morning. Toys arranged themselves in circles on the living room floor, their eyes all fixed on the hallway. One night, Mara woke to the sound of plastic wheels creaking and saw her daughter's walker rolling slowly across the nursery on its own. Sleep came harder. David complained of vivid dreams. Long corridors where the walls breathed, endless doors opening onto rooms filled with shadows. Mara dreamed too, though hers always ended with a voice whispering her name from inside the nursery walls. The baby's cries grew sharper, as though she felt what they couldn't see. The hallway grew colder as weeks passed. Step into it, and the air clamped down like ice. One night, when Mara carried her daughter through, the child's tiny body stiffened, eyes wide, mouth open in a scream that tore through the house. From then on, she refused to be carried past the hallway at all. David began noticing faces in the windows, not reflections, but pale shapes peering from the glass, as if the house itself was full of people pressed close, trying to look out. He stopped mentioning them to Mara after she begged him not to, but he knew she saw them too. Her eyes avoided the windows at night. They tried to bring in help. A priest sprinkled holy water, muttered prayers, and left in a hurry, refusing to return calls. A medium walked through once, stopped at the hallway, and refused to go farther. "It isn't the house," she whispered, trembling. "It's the space between the rooms." She left without charging, her shoes squeaking as she hurried to her car. The nights grew unbearable. At exactly 3:07, the lights would flicker out no matter what they tried. The baby monitor erupted with static, layered with the sound of breathing. The floorboards groaned with heavy footsteps pacing back and forth. Mara once opened the bedroom door to find the hallway stretched impossibly long, dozens of doors lining it, though their house had only 3 bedrooms. She blinked, and it snapped back to normal, but the chill never left her bones. The final night began like the others. They tried to sleep with the baby between them, desperate to keep her close. At 3:07, the lights died. The monitor crackled, then sang the same lullaby as the first night. Louder now, in a chorus of voices, the baby shrieked. David grabbed her, clutching her close, while Mara turned toward the hallway. The walls were moving. Plaster cracked, seams widening as if the house itself were breathing, expanding. From the gaps, hands slid through, thin, grey, too many fingers. They clawed at the air, grasping for purchase. The floor heaved, boards splitting. The photos on the wall all fell at once, glass shattering in unison. Mara screamed for David to run, but the front door wouldn't open. The knobs spun uselessly. Windows rattled but refused to break. The house shook, groaning like something alive. In the nursery, toys shrieked with distorted melodies, spinning in frantic circles. David bolted toward the back door, but the hallway stretched again, elongating with every step. The walls narrowed, the ceiling dropped, and the doors multiplied endlessly, each one marked with their daughter's name. Mara stumbled after him, clutching the child, her ears ringing with the voices chanting through the monitor. "Stay, stay, stay." When neighbors came the next morning, the bungalow was silent. Breakfast plates sat on the counter, half-eaten. Toys lay scattered in neat circles across the floor. The baby's crib was empty. No sign of the family remained, but those who walk by late at night swear they still hear it. A lullaby leaking through the walls, faint piano notes playing off-key, and the muffled cries of a baby, trapped somewhere in the spaces between the rooms. Lucas and Hannah moved into the split-level house in early spring, eager for a new start. It wasn't perfect. The roof sagged, the basement smelled faintly of mildew, but it was theirs. They spent the first weeks painting walls and planting flowers, trying to make it feel like home. At first, the house seemed almost too quiet, tucked into a cul-de-sac where the only noise came from distant traffic. But the quiet changed after the second month. One night, as Hannah unpacked boxes in the spare room, she heard a knock on the wall. She assumed it was Lucas hammering something downstairs, but when she called out, he answered from outside, still mowing the lawn. She pressed her ear to the wall and heard it again. 3 soft knocks, deliberate and close. She didn't tell Lucas, brushing it off as pipes, though her hands shook as she folded the last of the clothes. The knocks spread. Every night, the walls tapped, sometimes near the bedroom, sometimes by the stairs, sometimes high up near the ceiling as though someone crawled through the plaster. Lucas joked about rats until one evening he followed the noise to the basement. He flipped on the light and froze. The far wall was covered in handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the concrete with what looked like soot. Small, child-sized palms. He scrubbed until his arms ached, but in the morning the prints were back, darker than before. Hannah began losing things. Earrings, her watch, a pair of shoes. At first, she thought she was being careless, until she found them all returned in strange places. The shoes lined neatly on the basement stairs. The earrings buried in the soil of a potted plant. The watch dangling from the attic pull cord. Each time she discovered something, she felt eyes on her, a prickling awareness that she wasn't alone. The mirrors grew strange next. Their bathroom mirror fogged even when no one showered. Words appeared in the condensation. Help, stay, mine. Lucas accused Hannah of writing them, but when he watched the mirror directly, letters formed on their own, dragging slowly across the glass as though carved by an invisible finger. Sleep fled from them. Hannah woke to whispers, low and close, filling the room though she couldn't make out the words. Lucas dreamed of drowning, of waking with water filling his lungs, only to sit up gasping and find his pillow soaked. Some mornings, the sheets were covered in dirt, tracked in by no visible footprints. They called a contractor to check the house, thinking maybe animals lived in the walls. The man spent an hour inspecting before returning pale. "I don't know what this is," he muttered, gesturing to the basement wall. New handprints had appeared while he was there, overlapping the old ones. He packed his tools and left without charging, refusing to return calls. By midsummer, the house felt like a cage. Every door creaked open at night, even ones locked tight. Windows slammed shut when they tried to air it out. Lights flickered in strange rhythms, almost like signals. The air smelled of earth and iron. Hannah swore she saw a figure crouched at the end of the hall one night, too dark to be shadow, its head tilted as it watched her. When she blinked, it was gone. The worst came in August. Lucas went to the basement to reset the breaker after another outage. He didn't come back. Hannah called for him until her voice broke, then descended the stairs. The basement was silent, empty, except for the handprints. But among them was a new one, larger, deeper, still wet. Lucas's wedding ring lay on the floor beneath it. She tore through the house, screaming his name. Every room was empty. His phone, keys, and shoes were by the door. It was as though the house had swallowed him. She called the police, who searched the property. They found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of crime. One officer lingered by the basement stairs and muttered, "I wouldn't stay here if I were you." Hannah lasted 2 more nights. The house groaned constantly, walls flexing as if breathing. The mirrors showed not her own reflection, but rooms she didn't recognize, filled with shadows that twitched when she moved. On the last night, she woke to the weight of a hand pressing her chest. Neighbors claimed they heard the crash that night, like a tree splitting in two. But when they looked, the house stood silent in the dark. Days passed with no sign of Evan or Clara. The dog was found at the edge of the woods, shaking, fur-matted, refusing to approach the house. Inside, dishes still sat on the counter, clothes folded neatly in drawers, but every photo frame was empty. The living room wall was bare, save for the etched doorway, now deeper than before. Fresh handprints smeared the plaster, pressed outward, waiting for someone else to come close. Mara and David bought the bungalow because it felt safe. One floor, wide windows, sunlight pouring into every room. It was the opposite of the creaking Victorian they'd rented for years. They wanted something modest, something warm to raise their daughter in. The first weeks felt almost charmed. Friends admired the bright kitchen, the yard bloomed with wildflowers, and the house seemed to exhale welcome. But little by little, the brightness dimmed. It began with the baby monitor. Their daughter was only 6 months old, and Mara liked to keep the receiver close. One night, as she folded laundry, she heard a lullaby drifting through the speaker. Not the soft babbling of her child, but a low humming tune, unfamiliar and unsettling. She rushed into the nursery, finding her daughter asleep, alone. The humming stopped the moment she entered. David insisted it was interference, another monitor in a neighbor's home, but Mara couldn't shake the way the melody clung to her ears. Soon, the house made its own music. At first, faint piano notes echoing through the hall after midnight. Then entire chords played wrong, sour and jagged. They had no piano. David searched every room, attic to basement, but found nothing. When he returned, the sound swelled louder, as if mocking his effort. Objects began to shift. Mara set her keys on the counter, only to find them balanced precariously on the crib rail. A framed photo of her parents turned itself face down on the mantel each morning. Toys arranged themselves in circles on the living room floor, their eyes all fixed on the hallway. One night, Mara woke to the sound of plastic wheels creaking and saw her daughter's walker rolling slowly across the nursery on its own. Sleep came harder. David complained of vivid dreams. Long corridors where the walls breathed, endless doors opening onto rooms filled with shadows. Mara dreamed too, though hers always ended with a voice whispering her name from inside the nursery walls. The baby's cries grew sharper, as though she felt what they couldn't see. The hallway grew colder as weeks passed. Step into it, and the air clamped down like ice. One night, when Mara carried her daughter through, the child's tiny body stiffened, eyes wide, mouth open in a scream that tore through the house. From then on, she refused to be carried past the hallway at all. David began noticing faces in the windows, not reflections, but pale shapes peering from the glass, as if the